Thank you, Tom. We'll now turn to our final speaker, Kevon Martis. Kevon is the founding director of the Interstate Informed Citizens Coalition, based in Blissfield, Michigan. The coalition is a bipartisan renewable energy citizens watchdog group that promotes energy policy that is economically sound, environmentally friendly, and socially responsible. A graduate of the University of Michigan, Mr. Martis splits his time between family, his activist work, and operating his residential remodeling business. And I think that's for profit. He has a nonprofit venture which is restoring wooden boats.
That's correct. Thanks, Rob. Thanks for that introduction. I will get right to the point. We are truly a bipartisan group. About 40% of the people that support me in Michigan are self-described liberal environmentalists. The other rest are centrist and free market conservatives. Wind, in my opinion, is an equal opportunity offender. Why do we continue to subsidize wind energy? What are some of the false reasons put forward? Well, let me list a few of them. Is it to free the U.S. from Middle Eastern oil? Certainly not. We only generate 1% of our electricity from oil. In fact, we export more oil than we consume in the production of electricity. Is it because wind energy is cheaper than conventional generation? Absolutely not. Since wind energy is intermittent, these wind farms, wind plants, can replace neither base load nor load following generation facilities. They can only reduce fuel consumption at those facilities. Unsubsidized wind energy in most markets costs at least $100 a megawatt hour if you include the integration cost. Yet all that subsidized electricity can replace is the price of some gas or coal fuel, $25 or $35. It's an incredibly poor value. Can we diversify our energy generation by subsidizing wind? Well, no. Wind energy is paired primarily with gas generation. Gas-fired generation works as wind storage. Without storage, gas becomes the storage for wind energy's intermittent output. So by increasing through mandates and subsidies more and more wind energy, you're essentially pushing our energy generation sector into a blend of primarily wind and gas at the expense of coal and nuclear. You do not diversify, you de-diversify. You center on just one fuel combination, leaving our whole market subject to the vagaries of the natural gas futures market. Is it because wind is a complete solution to CO2 emissions? No, because wind is almost exclusively paired with fossil generation. It, unlike nuclear, can never permanently end CO2 emissions. As long as you have wind, you will be bound to fossil fuel. In fact, if the EPA mandated the closure of all coal and gas-fired generation in the U.S., that would be the end of the wind industry as well. No fossil, no wind. Is it because wind is the cheapest way to reduce CO2 emissions? This may surprise you. The National Academy of Sciences concluded this summer the reduction of CO2 emissions associated with the wind production tax credit is, however, small, amounting to only about 0.3% of CO2 emissions from the energy sector in the reference scenario. If we do the math on how much CO2 has been reduced and divide it out by the amount of revenue lost to the Treasury, they come up with a price of $250 per ton of CO2 avoided. Internal Obama administration memo suggests that the number used internally for references, it's only worth 15 bucks. So the PTC is costing us $250 per ton to avoid a substance that the government values at only $15 to $20. Is it because wind is a fast solution to CO2 emissions? Well, far from it. In my home state, Michigan's wind mandate has cost $202.5 billion in wind plus transmission since 2008. At most, this has reduced coal emissions by 4%, assuming that it displaced only coal. It almost certainly did not. But here's the sad thing. Had we spent $2.5 billion on combined cycle gas turbines, we could have already retired 50% of our coal fleet. We could have slashed Michigan's CO2 emissions by 25% and mercury and fine particulates by half. It's a colossally bad deal if you're an environmentally minded person. Is it because wind energy is a fledgling technology that once mature can end our reliance upon fossil fuel technology? No, wind has already had 20 years of subsidies, and even former Secretary Chu proclaimed that wind is a mature technology. So then, finally, and this is the activist in me, is the PTC repeatedly extended because there's political advantage and campaign cash available to politicians who promote wind energy? Candidly, yes. A couple conclusions, and I'll be quiet. As a nation, we need to ask ourselves, what is the primary driver of our energy policy? For those who believe climate change is an imminent catastrophe, we need a solution that is fast, cheap, and thorough. Wind fails those criteria in spades. And if our primary concern is cheap electricity of high value, to foster economic competitiveness on a global scale while raising the quality of life for all our citizens, wind loses again and by huge margins. Unlike the majority of energy policy lobbyists and activists walking the halls of the Capitol, I am not here asking for a federal carve-out for my personal financial gain. Neither am I here selling thinly disguised policy suggestions that benefit some distant corporate or industrial benefactor. I'm a simple volunteer citizen activist who's on the receiving end of state renewable energy mandates and on the paying end of federal wind subsidies. I am also a victim of anti-coal, anti-gas, and anti-nuclear NIMBYs and green energy opportunists like Mr. Goggin in the back row. And in my more than 4 years of investigating wind energy and observing firsthand its onerous impact upon economics, the environment, and the human communities that have to live inside massive wind plants, I have come to a simple and final conclusion. Subsidizing wind energy is like hiring one of my teenage sons to work in my construction business. They're seldom there when there is real work to be done. When they do show up, they have a highly inflated opinion of their relative contribution to the task at hand. Nevertheless, they demand to be paid far more than their adult co-workers for their juvenile efforts, and they then reward you by keeping you up all night with incessant and annoying noise that you are absolutely powerless to stop. It makes no sense to claim that we need an all-of-the-above energy policy to wean us from climate-damaging fossil fuel plants by then subsidizing a source of energy that can only replace a small fraction of that fossil generation, but at a snail's pace and a very high price. It is time to end the wind PTC.
All right, thank you very much.